Chapter 1. The Storm. 4 young people, 2 girls and 2 boys, were standing in the long grass in the middle of Litchford Green Airfield. The airfield wasn't used anymore, and all its buildings were in ruins. Their roofs had fallen, and their walls were broken. Grass and weeds grew in broken places in the concrete runways. The airfield's gates were shut. They hadn't been opened for many years. But the wire fence around the airfield was broken in many places. The kids had walked through one of the broken places. It was raining, and the kids were cold and wet. "This doesn't look very exciting," one of the girls said. "But it will be a good subject for our project." The girl who had spoken was Frankie Fitzgerald. Frankie, a pretty, fair-haired girl, was 13 years old. The other girl was 11-year-old Regan Vanderlinden. Her hair was dark. The 2 boys, Jack and Tom Christmas, were brothers. Jack was 13 and Tom was 12. Both were fair-haired. "This is a very sad place," Jack Christmas said. "Something terrible happened here once. Perhaps it happened during the Second World War." Jack often said things like this. He often knew things which he couldn't explain. Sometimes he knew what was going to happen before it happened. Sometimes he knew what had happened in the past, without being told about it. "Take your photos quickly, Tom," Jack said to his brother. "Then we can all go home. I don't like it here." Tom Christmas looked around carefully. Then he lifted his camera and began to take pictures. Suddenly, the younger girl ran in front of Tom. "Hi, take a picture of me," she shouted. "Get out of the way, Regan," Tom replied. "I want to take photos for our project. I don't want pictures of a crazy American kid." Regan's blue eyes were shining. She laughed and pushed her long black hair away from her face. "There's plenty of time for the project," she said. "No, there isn't. We've only got 2 weeks," Tom said. "Today is the 24th of August. We have to finish the project by the 6th of September, and we haven't started it yet." The 4 friends went to the same school. They were all members of the school's archaeology club. Their history teacher, Mrs. Tinker, was in charge of the club. She'd asked all the members of the club to do a project during the summer holiday. They all had to find out about the history of their town of Litchford between the years 1939 and 1945. That was the time of the Second World War. Frankie Fitzgerald had told her 3 friends about the airfield. Litchford Green Airfield, which was at the edge of the town, had been a very important place during the war. Frankie knew about it because she had lived in Litchford all her life. So Frankie, Jack, Tom, and Regan had decided to do a project about the airfield together. "My grandmother was a young girl during the Second World War," Frankie said, as they looked around the wet, ruined airfield. "Gran remembers the Battle of Britain in 1940. Spitfire fighter planes flew from this airfield to fight the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. The airfield was a busy place then." "It's just a ruin now," Regan said. "We'll see the airfield better from above," Frankie went on. "Daryl is trying to arrange a plane flight for us. He has a friend who flies an old plane." "That will be brilliant," Tom said. "I'll be able to take more photos from the plane." The rain was falling heavily now, and a strong wind was blowing. Suddenly, there was a flash of lightning. The sound of thunder followed it at once. The four friends were in the middle of a terrible storm. "Run!" Tom shouted. "Run back to Daryl's van!" As the kids ran towards the fence, lightning turned everything white again. Then there was a tremendous noise. They were all thrown to the ground. Reagan looked up and screamed. A black shape was falling out of the dark clouds. Tom looked up too. "It's a Spitfire," he shouted, "and it's going to crash." Another flash of lightning showed the Spitfire more clearly. Flames and smoke were coming from the engine of the falling plane. "No, no!" Reagan shouted. At that moment, the plane hit the ground. Chapter 2. The Pilot. Regan jumped up and ran, but she didn't run towards Daryl's van. She ran towards the other side of the airfield. There was only one thought in her mind: the pilot. There was a pilot in that plane, and the plane was on fire. It was burning. They had to get the pilot out. Soon, Reagan was near enough to see the plane clearly. The Spitfire had crashed about 200 meters outside the airfield. It had crashed onto a small house. Reagan screamed when she saw this, but she ran on. Then she saw a black shape on the grass, about 20 meters in front of her. The shape moved and stood up. It was a man. He was wearing a leather jacket and a leather helmet. It was the pilot. Reagan screamed again. The pilot looked at her, then he ran towards the house. He tried to get into the house, but the flames from the burning plane were too hot. "Help me!" the man shouted. "The children are in there." Reagan saw a flash and heard a terrible roar. Flames jumped high into the sky. The pilot was lifted into the air for a moment. Then he crashed onto the ground. The house was on fire now, but the plane had gone. Reagan ran to the pilot. The airman's clothes were burnt and torn. Reagan saw his face. It was terribly cut and burnt, but his eyes were open. The pilot was still alive. "We must get Daryl and the van here now," Reagan shouted to her friends who were running towards her. "We must take this man to a hospital." The four friends ran back across the airfield. The storm was almost finished. The sky was getting lighter. Now they could see their friend Daryl Pepper sitting in his old van by the airfield gates. "What's wrong?" Daryl asked. "Didn't you hear anything?" Reagan asked. "A plane crashed onto a house on the other side of the airfield. The pilot is badly injured. We must take him to a hospital." The kids jumped into the van, and Daryl drove it through a broken place in the fence. Soon they were on the other side of the airfield. "Which way shall I go now, Reagan?" Daryl shouted. "I can't see a house anywhere. Where is it?" Reagan opened her mouth, but she couldn't speak. There was no house, no plane, no pilot. There was nothing. Daryl stopped the van. Suddenly, the sun was shining. A bird began to sing. The four kids and their friend got out of the van. "What exactly did you see?" Daryl asked. "It began with the storm," Jack said. "What storm?" said Daryl. "There wasn't a storm." "What about the thunder? What about the lightning? What about the rain?" Jack replied. "There was a little rain," Daryl said, "but there was no thunder or lightning." "And what about the plane crash?" Reagan said. "We all saw it and heard it. Were we all dreaming? Did we all have the same dream?" "The plane was a Spitfire," Tom said. He knew a lot about old planes. and it crashed near here, onto a house just outside the fence. Reagan went on. The pilot had got out of the plane, but he ran back towards the house. He spoke to me. He said something about some children. He spoke with an American accent. While Reagan and Tom had been talking to Daryl, Jack had walked through a broken place in the fence. Suddenly, he shouted to the others, "Come over here," he said. "Look at this. There was a house here once, a long time ago. You can see the shape of its walls on the ground. It's a ruin now, and it's covered with grass and weeds. But there's terrible sadness here. Something terrible did happen here once." Reagan turned away. "I don't want to stay here anymore," she said. Silently, they all got into the van. Daryl drove very carefully back into Litchford. "Did we all have the same dream?" Jack asked. "No, it wasn't a dream," Reagan said. "We didn't all see the same things." In her mind, the American girl could still see the cuts and burns on the airman's face. Chapter 3. Daryl's Idea. Daryl Pepper lived in a big room at the top of an old house. Daryl was the kid's friend. He was 19 years old, but some of his hair was already gray. He had a long, thin body and long, thin legs. He wore thick glasses. Daryl had been a student at the kids' school. He'd been the first member of the archaeology club. He was very interested in history and science, and he had many books about these subjects. He didn't work in an office or a factory, but he often delivered things for people in his old van. He earned some money that way. Daryl's room was full of old furniture, books, papers, and pieces of machinery. His computer stood on a big desk near a window. The rest of the desk was covered with papers. Reagan, Frankie, Jack, and Tom met in Daryl's room on the morning after their visit to the airfield. "Well, who can explain what happened yesterday?" Jack asked. "I have an idea," Daryl said. "Some scientists have a theory which could explain it. It's the psychic stain theory." "What's that?" Tom asked quickly. "Well, sometimes a terrible thing happens and it leaves a mark in time," Daryl replied. "The mark never disappears. It's like a stain that never fades. Then the terrible thing is repeated forever and ever. The theory could be correct. Lots of people believe in ghosts. Perhaps ghosts are psychic stains, too." "So that crash did happen, but it didn't happen yesterday. Is that what you think, Daryl?" Jack asked. "Yes," Daryl replied. "It happened in the past, and it left a mark in time. Now it's like a videotape which is playing again and again. And yesterday, you all saw it." "But why hasn't anyone seen the crash before?" Frankie asked. "I've lived in Litchford all my life. I've never heard anything about it." "That's an interesting question," Daryl replied. "I want to find out more about that crash," Reagan said. "When did it happen? Who was the American pilot?" "I've been asking some of my friends about this," Daryl said. "There are a few Spitfires still flying. They fly in air shows and exhibitions. But no Spitfire has crashed in this area since 1945. So your Spitfire probably crashed during the Second World War. Perhaps it was in a battle with a German fighter plane," Tom said. "That poor pilot," Reagan said. "He tried to save some children who were in that house. Were they all killed?" Jack remembered his feelings about the house. Yes, they were all killed. He replied sadly. I want to know what happened, Reagan said. Where can we find out about this, Daryl? Well, that crash was repeated yesterday for a good reason, Daryl said. Why? What was the reason? Was the date important? Tom asked. Yesterday was the 24th of August. Did the crash happen on the same date, many years ago? Yes, that's exactly what I think, Daryl replied. Then we can make some guesses, Tom said. The first Spitfires flew in 1938. The Second World War began a year later, in 1939. The war ended in 1945. So the crash happened sometime between 1938 and 1945. Then Tom looked puzzled. But Spitfires were British planes, he went on. Why was an American pilot flying the one that we saw? My grandmother might remember something about the crash, Frankie said. I'll ask her about it. I'm going to visit her this afternoon. I've got a better idea, Tom said quickly. Let's ask someone at the Litchford newspaper, the Litchford Gazette. Jack and I will go to the office of the Gazette. We need facts, not just memories. Does the Gazette office keep copies of the old newspapers, Daryl? Yes, Daryl replied. I have a friend who works there. I'll phone him. He'll let you look at the papers. And I'll go with Frankie to see her gran, Reagan said. I prefer old people to old newspapers. That's fine, Daryl said. Then you'll have the facts and the memories. Brilliant, all the children said together. Let's meet tomorrow at my house, Reagan said. Will 4 o'clock be okay? Chapter 4. Facts and Memories. Hello, Frankie dear. What a nice surprise, old Mrs. Fitzgerald said. And you've brought Reagan with you. Sit down, both of you. We'll all have some tea. In a few minutes, they were all drinking tea and eating biscuits. Frankie began to speak about the project. We went to the old airfield yesterday, Gran, she said. We're doing a project about the Second World War for our archaeology club. We're trying to find out about the fighter planes that flew from Litchford Green. We're trying to find out about the pilots, too. What do you remember about the war, Gran? I remember lots of things, the old lady replied. The airfield was very busy then. There were lots of planes there. The pilots were all tall and good-looking. They came into my mother's shop sometimes. Do you remember a plane crashing near the airfield? Frankie asked. Oh, yes, the old lady replied. The pilot died and so did some evacuees. My mother told me about it. It was very sad. What were evacuees? Reagan asked. During the war, the Germans often bombed our cities, Mrs. Fitzgerald said. So lots of children from the cities were sent to live in the countryside. They were called evacuees. Their parents wanted them to be safe from the bombs. London was bombed almost every day. Lots of children from London were sent to this area. The 4 children who were killed came from London. They were sent to Litchford to be safe. Reagan and Frankie looked at each other. So it was all true. The plane had crashed onto the house by the airfield. 5 people had died nearly 60 years ago. But the 4 friends had seen it happen yesterday. Why did the crash happen, Gran? Frankie asked. I don't know, Mrs. Fitzgerald replied. I was only 5 years old in 1940, But Florrie Skinner will remember. She's much older than me, but she remembers everything from those days. Florrie was a WAAF during the war. A what? Reagan asked with a laugh. She was in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the old lady said. The members of that were called WAAFS. WAFs didn't fly the planes, but they did important work. Florrie worked in the operations room on the airfield. That was the place where the movements of all the planes were organized. Where does she live, Gran? Can we talk to her? Frankie asked. She lives in an old people's home, Mrs. Fitzgerald replied. She lives there with lots of other old people. She's not strong now, and the nurses at the home look after her. But she enjoys having visitors. I'll take you to see her tomorrow morning. We can't go now. It's after 2 o'clock, and Florrie always sleeps in the afternoons. Half an hour later, Frankie, Reagan, Jack, and Tom were in the Vanderlindens' sitting room. Reagan had given each of her friends a can of cola and a bag of potato crisps. Reagan's parents were very rich. They owned a big house in Litchford. But most of the time, Mr. Vanderlinden worked in other countries. This summer, he was working in Rome, and his wife was there with him. Regan was living in the big house in Litchford with an 18-year-old blonde girl from California. The girl was the Vanderlindens' au pair. She was called Jenny St. Clair. Her job was to look after Regan. But Jenny wasn't clever, and she didn't work hard. She made a lot of expensive phone calls to her boyfriend in the USA, but she didn't care about Regan. So Regan looked after herself, and she had a great time. But Regan didn't like Jenny. When she talked to her friends about the au pair, she called her by a rude name, the blonde bimbo. When they had finished their crisps, the girls told the boys about Frankie's gran and about Florrie Skinner. We're going to visit Florrie tomorrow, Reagan said. What did you find out at the newspaper office? Well, the crash happened on the 24th of August, 1940, Jack said. And your gran was right. The Spitfire crashed onto a little house near the airfield. 4 young evacuees from London were killed. The pilot died too, Tom told the girls. And he wasn't an American. He was a Canadian. His name was Glenn Loosthawk. Why was he in England in 1940? Reagan asked. He was studying at a university here when the war started, Jack said. Glenn joined the Royal Air Force. He was only 20 years old when his plane crashed. He was very unlucky, Tom went on. He'd been in a battle with some German planes. His radio wasn't working, and suddenly there was a terrible storm. He crashed onto the house. A lot of fuel was stored there. The fuel exploded and everyone was killed. The crash wasn't the pilot's fault, Reagan said quickly. Well, Glenn Loosthawk made a mistake. That's what the newspaper said, Tom replied. It was only Glenn's 3rd flight in a Spitfire. It wasn't Glenn's fault, Reagan said again. And he tried to save those evacuees. I saw him running towards the house. The newspaper didn't say that, Tom said. No, it didn't, Reagan said. We're the only people who saw the crash, and we only saw it 2 days ago. Those evacuees were the same ages as us, Jack said. They were 13, 12, and 11. There were 2 boys and 2 girls. The boys were brothers, like Tom and me. That's terrible, Frankie said. They left their parents in London. They came to Litchford to be safe, but they were killed here. Poor kids. And Poor Glenn, Reagan said. No one else will ever know the truth about him now. He was a good man. Perhaps Florrie Skinner knew him. We'll ask her tomorrow. We've still got a lot to do, Tom said. Daryl is trying to borrow a metal detector for us. If we search the airfield with that, we'll find all kinds of things. There must be pieces of planes in the ground. Anything that we find can be part of our project. Perhaps Daryl will arrange that flight for us too, Frankie said. Yes, that will be great, Jack replied. Tom and I will put all our notes onto our computer tomorrow. You two girls can talk to the old lady at the old people's home. Chapter 5. What do you want me to do? Reagan was asleep in her bed. She was dreaming. In her dream, she heard the roaring engines of planes and the thud of exploding bombs. The ground was shaking. She smelt smoke and she saw flames. She heard screams and the sounds of people running. "Stop! Stop! Come back! Don't leave me!" she shouted. Then a dark shape was standing in front of the flames. It was a man. It was the dead pilot, Glenn Loosetalk. In her dream, Reagan looked at his terrible, burnt face and she screamed. Suddenly, she was awake, but the ground was still shaking. Reagan got out of bed. She walked towards the window and pulled back the curtains. There was a red glow in the dark sky. The glow was over Litchford Green Airfield. Reagan turned away from the window. She got dressed quickly and went downstairs. 10 minutes later, she was on her bike, cycling to the airfield. The night was fine and clear. The American girl reached the airfield and left her bike by the gates. She found a broken place in the fence and walked through it. Almost immediately, heavy rain started to fall. Then Reagan heard a voice. "Help me! For God's sake, help me! The children! The children!" The voice was coming to her from across the airfield. Reagan closed her eyes for half a minute. Then she opened them again. Nothing had changed. "I'm not asleep," she said to herself. "The children," the voice shouted again. Reagan started to run across the airfield. After a moment, she saw the burning house. "I can't help you. It's too late," she shouted. Lightning flashed. Thunder roared. The heavy rain fell on her face, but she went on running towards the flames. Then the pilot was standing in front of her. There was blood on his face. His clothes were burnt and torn. "What do you want me to do?" Reagan shouted. The man took a step towards her. Reagan screamed. Then she turned and ran hack towards the gates. But suddenly the pilot was standing in front of her again. Reagan tried to turn, but she slipped and fell to the ground. A hand touched her shoulder. Reagan looked up. "What do you want me to do?" she said again. This time she spoke quietly. The man pointed towards the burning house. "I can't do anything," she said. "It's too late. It happened nearly 60 years ago." Reagan stood up and started walking. Soon she was near the fence. As she walked through the broken place in the fence, the rain stopped. The night was fine and clear again, but Reagan was wet and very cold. She got on her bike and rode slowly home. She was shaking with cold and fear. "I must tell the others about this," she said to herself. "But they must finish the project without me." So that's why I'm not going to the airfield again, Reagan said. I had to see you and tell you. It was the next morning. The four friends were in Jack and Tom's house. Jack, Tom, and Frankie had heard Reagan's story. The pilot was trying to tell you something, Tom said. Why did you run away from him? I was terrified, Reagan replied. I was very, very frightened. I'm not going back to the airfield. Okay, Tom said with a smile. If you're afraid, you don't have to help us. I want to help you, Reagan replied angrily. Then she was silent for a few moments. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet. I will go back to the airfield, if you all come with me, she said. Okay, said Tom. Then the phone rang, and Jack answered it. When he put the phone down, he smiled at the others. That was Daryl, he said. He's arranged our flight. His friend will take us up in the old plane tomorrow. Brilliant, Tom said. Daryl told me something else, his brother went on. There's a private museum at the Litchford Country Club. It tells the story of Litchford Green Airfield during the Second World War. Daryl has arranged for us to go there. We can go now. You two go there, Reagan said. Frankie and I will talk to Florrie Skinner. We'll all meet at my house later. Chapter 6. The Museum. Jack and Tom were standing in the little museum at the Litchford Country Club. Outside, members of the club were playing tennis and swimming in the pool. An old gentleman with a big white mustache was smiling at the boys. My name is George Ballard, he said. I worked at the airfield during the war. I was a flight sergeant in the Royal Air Force. Please look around the museum. Ask me questions if you want to. Thanks, Tom said. Took at these pictures, Jack. He pointed to some photos which were hanging on a wall. This is a Spitfire fighter plane, and this one is a Lancaster bomber. You're quite right, George Ballard said. Now look at this. The old man was happy to talk to the boys. He wanted to show them everything in the museum. Jack wrote notes, and Tom asked a lot of questions. At the far end of the room, George Ballard stopped in front of a big photo of the airfield. The photo had been taken from the air. This picture was given to us by some friends in Germany, George Ballard said. It was taken by a German airman in a Dornier bomber, just after the Luftwaffe attacked the airfield on the 28th of August, 1940. Look, you can see the 3 runways very clearly. What are all those white marks? Tom asked. Those are bomb craters, the big holes made by the German bombs, George Ballard replied. The operations room, we called it the ops room, was hit by a big bomb too. A lot of people died on the 28th of August. The station commander died too. His name was Squadron Leader Alfred Laybridge Smith. This is a photograph of him. George Ballard pointed to a smaller picture. It showed a middle-aged man wearing RAF uniform. So the squadron leader was in charge of the airfield when the Spitfire crashed onto the house by the fence, Tom said. George Ballard looked very surprised. How do you know about that? He asked. We found out about it for our school project, Jack said quickly. It was sad, George Ballard said. The pilot made a mistake. He was a young man, and he'd only flown a Spitfire a few times. And the weather was terrible, too. He was unlucky. Jack moved on. He looked down into a cabinet with a glass top. Inside it, there were more photos, an old watch, a leather flying helmet, and then an empty space. In the space was a small card with the words, "Notebook, borrowed by Mr. Terry Bowles." Jack put his hand on the glass. It was very, very cold. Suddenly he knew something. The notebook that had been in the cabinet was very important. "What was here, Mr. Ballard?" he asked. "Squadron Leader Leebridge Smith's diary," George Ballard replied. "The squadron leader's grandson, Mr. Terry Bowles, has borrowed it. He's a businessman. He's a very clever man, too. The diary was written in a secret code, and Terry Bowles has discovered the secret of the code. He's going to write a book about his grandfather. The diary will help him with that, but he hasn't told anyone what's in the diary yet." Reagan and Frankie were at the old people's home, talking to Florrie Skinner. The old lady was blind. She could no longer see anything. But her mind was clear. She was very happy to talk to the girls. She remembered many things about the war. She remembered the Luftwaffe's attack on the airfield on the 28th of August, 1940. "I was working in the ops room when the bomb hit it," Florrie said. "I was lucky, but some of my friends were killed. That was a terrible day. I had bad dreams about it for years afterwards." "You must have some very sad memories," Reagan said. The old lady smiled. "Yes, but they aren't all sad," she replied. "I had a lovely boyfriend. He was a Canadian, and he was very good-looking. I'll never forget him." "A Canadian," Reagan said. "What was his name?" "Was his name Glenn Loosetalk?" Frankie asked quietly. Florrie Skinner smiled again. "Glenn," she said. "Yes, that's right, Glenn. I've got a photo of him. Would you like to see it?" "Oh, yes, please," the two girls said together. The old lady walked slowly across the room. She sat down on her bed. Her fingers found an old red box on the small table beside it. She opened the box and took out a big envelope. "Here are my photos," she said. "Come here and sit on the bed. Find the picture of Glenn." Frankie opened the envelope and looked through the old photos. The first ones showed Florrie as a little girl. Then there was one which showed her as a pretty young woman in WAAF uniform. And next, there was a photo of a young airman. He was tall and very good-looking. Frankie turned the picture over. On the back were the words, "Glenn, 21st July, 1940. Reagan took the photograph and looked at it. The American girl's eyes were full of tears. "Have you found the picture of Glenn?" Florrie Skinner asked. "Yes, we've found it," Reagan said quietly. "That was the last picture that I took of him," Florrie said. "He was killed soon afterwards, and 4 children died the same day. They were evacuees. They were lovely children. Glenn and I had become good friends with them. They died on the same day as Glenn, but I saw them in the ops room 4 days later. That was the day of the German attack." "You saw the evacuees after they were dead," Frankie said. "Yes. They were wearing strange clothes, but I knew them," Florrie replied. "They looked like living children, but they were ghosts. Poor little ghosts." Chapter 7. The Phantom Airman. The 4 friends met again in the afternoon. They had a lot to talk about. That diary sounds interesting, Frankie said. I'd like to see it. We could phone Mr. Bowles, Jack said. Reagan had been very quiet. She suddenly stood up and began to speak. I've got to go to the airfield, she said. I've got to find out what Glenn wants. When will you go? Jack asked. Not at night, she replied. I'm too scared to go at night. I'm going now. Then we'll all go with you, Frankie said. Well, thanks, Reagan said. But please remember this. Glenn's face is frightening. You haven't seen it, I have. Don't worry, Jack said. We'll all do this together. Come on, Frankie said. We'll all go on our bikes. But when they got to the airfield, everything there had changed. They got off their bikes by the old airfield gates. What's happening? Tom asked. There was a big sign on the gates. Facelift Construction is building Litchford Green Industrial Estate here. We're building a new future for Litchford. Private. Keep out. Some of the fence had gone. There were trucks and a big bulldozer standing by the ruins of the control tower. There were some mechanical diggers and a big roll of new fence wire. But there were no workmen anywhere. What about our archaeology project? Frankie said. We won't be able to get onto the airfield when these people start work. And what about Glenn? Reagan asked. I've got to speak to him again. I'm going to do it now. Reagan started to walk across the airfield. Come on, she called to the others. This is our last chance. Frankie, Jack, and Tom followed her. That little hill on the right is where the ops room was, Tom said. We found out about it at the museum. The RAF built the ops room and some offices under the ground. Then they covered the roof with earth. They tried to make it safe. But the bomb hit it on the 28th of August, 1940, and several people were killed. We can't get in now. The entrance was covered with earth years ago. Reagan went on walking for a moment. Then she stopped and shouted into the air. Glenn, I'm here. I want to help you. There was silence. The four friends waited. Suddenly, a shape appeared in front of them. Look, Reagan whispered. It's Glenn. Reagan began to run towards the ghost. Glenn was wearing his leather jacket and helmet. But this time, his leather helmet covered his face. He's done that to help me, Reagan said to herself. He doesn't want to frighten me. The phantom airman pointed across the airfield. Yes, that's where it happened, Reagan said. What do you want me to do? The ghost began to fade away. Glenn, don't disappear, Reagan shouted. Please don't go, Glenn. What do you want? You must tell me. But the phantom airman had gone. He wants you to look over there, Jack said. He was pointing to the ruins of the old house. Reagan walked on towards the ruins, looking down at the grass. She felt a hand on her shoulder and she turned quickly. But there was no one there. Glenn, she said quietly. Reagan pushed at the earth with her foot. She could see a piece of metal in the ground. She bent down and pulled the piece of twisted metal from the earth. The metal was very, very cold. Did you want me to find this, Glenn? She asked. Hey, you over there, a man's voice shouted. Reagan turned quickly. A fat man was walking towards her. He wasn't a ghost. Jack, Frankie, and Tom walked over to Reagan. The four friends stood close together. "What are you doing here?" the fat man shouted. "This land is private." The man was about 40. He had a round, red face and he looked very angry. "Can't you children read the sign?" the fat man shouted. "What do they teach you at school these days?" "They teach us to find out about things. They teach us to think," Reagan said with a smile. "We are working on an important archaeology project about the Second World War. We haven't finished studying this airfield yet." "Oh, yes, you have," the man said angrily. "This land belongs to Facelift Construction now." The man took a mobile phone out of his pocket. "Are you going to leave, or shall I call the police?" he asked. Reagan opened her mouth, but Jack spoke quickly. "Please don't do that," he said. "We're leaving now." The four friends walked slowly back to their bikes. The man stood and watched them. Chapter 8. The Message. The kids went back to Reagan's house. Reagan put the piece of twisted metal on a table in the sitting room. They all looked at it in silence for a few minutes. "Come on, do something," Reagan said to the piece of metal. Nothing happened. "Do you want it to talk to you?" Tom asked. "I want it to help us," Reagan replied. 10 minutes later, the piece of metal hadn't done anything. "Oh, come on," Reagan said. "Let's go into the kitchen and get a drink." Soon, they were all sitting round the kitchen table with cans of cola. "We're going up in the old plane tomorrow," Tom said. "I'm glad about that. If I can't take any more photos on the airfield, I'll take some from the air above it." "We won't be able to use the metal detector, though," Frankie said sadly. "Oh, let's just forget about the project," Reagan said angrily. She got up suddenly and went back into the sitting room. A moment later, the others heard her screaming. Come here quickly," Reagan shouted. "It's moved! The metal has moved!" Frankie, Jack, and Tom ran into the sitting room. They all stared down at the table. One word had been scratched into the shiny wood. Traitor. "Was there a traitor at the airfield?" Jack said. "Was someone there helping the Germans? Is that what Glenn is telling us?" "Let's go back into the kitchen," Tom said. "The message probably isn't finished yet. Perhaps the metal will write some more if we don't watch it." "It might write some more, but not on this table," Reagan replied. "My parents paid more than $2,000 for it in New York City. I'm taking the metal upstairs, to my bedroom." She picked up the piece of metal carefully, and the others followed her upstairs. Reagan put the piece of metal on a desk near the window in her room. "We'll leave it alone now," she said. "We'll go back to the kitchen and I'll cook some pizza." During the next 2 hours, Reagan went up to her bedroom several times. The metal hadn't moved. At last, it was evening. Jack and Tom had to go home. But Frankie decided to stay at Reagan's house for the night. She phoned her mother with this news. Late in the evening, Jenny St. Clair came home. She had been out of the house for most of the day. Now she went straight to her own room. "The blonde bimbo will be watching TV all night," Reagan said. "She doesn't care what I do. Why does my father pay her?" After that, the two friends went up to Reagan's bedroom again. The piece of metal still hadn't moved. There were 2 beds in the room, and each girl sat on one. Later, they heard Jenny go downstairs. Soon, The house was quiet again. Then the piece of metal began to move. It moved slowly over the top of the desk. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The girls watched it from their beds. They couldn't speak. They were terrified. Suddenly, the bedroom door was opened wide. "You stupid, stupid kid!" Jenny St. Clair shouted. "You're crazy, that's what you are. You've wrecked that table in the sitting room. It must have cost your parents thousands of dollars. I'm going to phone your mother about this. Now." The piece of metal had stopped moving at the moment when Jenny came into the room. Reagan was glad about that. She didn't want the au pair to see it. "It was an accident, Jenny," Reagan said. "Someone can repair the table. I'll pay for the work myself." Suddenly, her voice was angry. "Don't phone my mother, Jenny," she said. "If you do, I'll tell her a few things about you. You watch TV all the time and phone people in the U.S. You don't look after me at all. I'll tell my mother that." Jenny was very angry. She went towards Reagan's bed, but then she saw the scratches on the desk. "You're wrecking the furniture in here, too," she shouted. She ran to the desk and picked up the piece of metal. Then she turned and left the room with it. She closed the door behind her with a loud noise. "Come back here. Give me that," Reagan shouted. She opened the door and ran downstairs after Jenny. Frankie got up and walked over to the desk. She wanted to see what the piece of metal had written now. She saw a line of letters, scratched into the wood. "Help me safe under there. Help me rest safe under the air," Frankie read. "What does that mean? I don't understand," she said to herself. She heard the front door close with a loud noise. Reagan was coming back upstairs. A moment later, she came into the bedroom. "Do you know what Jenny has done?" Reagan shouted. "She ran out of the house. Then she threw that piece of metal into a truck that was passing. Can you believe that? The metal has gone forever. How can we help Glenn now?" "Well, the metal did write several words," said Frankie. "They might help us. Come and see." Reagan looked at the letters on the top of the desk. "I don't understand," she said. "I'm tired. Let's go to bed now. We'll phone the boys about this in the morning." Chapter 9. Glenn did this. Back at their house, Jack and Tom were talking about Glenn's strange message. Traitor. What was the phantom airman trying to tell them? "Perhaps there was a traitor on the airfield," Tom said. "I want to see the squadron leader's diary. We might learn about the traitor from that." "Yes," Jack replied. "But there's something strange about the diary. I'm sure of that. Let's phone the squadron leader's grandson, Terry Bowles." "Give me the phone book, Jack," his brother said. Tom read out the number and Jack dialed it. In a few moments, a woman's voice answered. Jack asked for Mr. Bowles. "I'm sorry. Mr. Bowles isn't here at the moment," the woman said. "I'm his wife. Can I help you?" "I'm not sure," Jack said. "My name is Jack Christmas. My friends and I are doing a project about Litchford Airfield in the Second World War. There was a traitor on the airfield in 1940. Someone in the RAF was working for the Germans. But we don't know who it was. We'd like to see Squadron Leader Laybridge Smith's diary. Can we speak to your husband about it when he comes home?" Mrs. Bowles laughed. There was no traitor, she said. I've been helping my husband with his work on the diary. There's nothing in it about a traitor. You've watched too many spy films, Jack. But tell me your phone number. I'll ask my husband to phone you when he has time. He's very busy at the moment. Jack put down the phone. We won't get any help from Mr. or Mrs. Bowles, he said. Let's finish putting our notes onto the computer. We'll talk to the girls about this in the morning. In the middle of the night, Reagan woke up suddenly. Something strange was happening. She was falling through the air and her room was full of smoke. She fell to the ground, but she wasn't hurt. She had fallen very gently. But now, part of her bedroom was on fire. She saw flames moving through the room. The flames moved nearer and nearer to the terrified girl. And then they covered her. Now Frankie was awake too. She heard noises, guns firing, and loud explosions that shook the room. Huge flames were everywhere. They were on the walls, on the curtains, and all round her bed. And Reagan had gone. Where was she? Frankie opened her mouth. She was going to scream. Then she saw Reagan. The American girl was walking through the flames towards her. The flames are cold, Reagan whispered, as she sat on Frankie's bed. Then the bed started to move, and all the other furniture in the room started to move too. It turned round and round. Everything was covered in flames, but the flames were as cold as ice. Suddenly there was silence. No noise. No flames. The two girls sat on the bed and looked at each other. The room was wrecked. Everything was on the floor. Books, clothes, magazines. Regan pushed her long black hair away from her face. "Hi," she said. "What happened?" Frankie gasped. "Glenn did this," Reagan replied. "He's angry because we didn't get all of his message. Perhaps—" She didn't finish her sentence because they heard a terrible scream outside the door. "Jenny!" Reagan shouted. She ran to the door and pulled it open. Outside the bedroom, Reagan and Frankie saw Jenny. She was floating above their heads. She was turning round and round in a strong wind, and as they watched, the wind pushed Jenny to the top of the stairs. "No, Glenn! No!" Reagan shouted. "Don't hurt her!" The wind stopped, and Jenny fell gently to the floor. She stared at the two friends for a moment. Then, without speaking, she got up and walked into her own room. She shut the door behind her. Reagan and Frankie went back into Reagan's room. Together they put everything in its place. Nothing had been broken. Nothing had been burnt. Then the two girls lay on their beds and fell asleep immediately. Frankie and Reagan were still asleep when the boys rang the doorbell the next morning. When the girls were dressed, everybody went into the kitchen. Reagan told Jack and Tom what had happened. "Why did you let Jenny throw away the piece of metal?" Tom asked Reagan. "Now we've only got half a message, and we can't understand it." At that moment, the kitchen door opened and Jenny came into the room. "Hi, Jenny," Reagan said. "You look terrible." This was true. Jenny looked tired and frightened. "You must tell me something," Jenny said. "In the middle of the night, did I wake up on the floor outside my room? That's what I remember. You were there. I saw you. But perhaps I was dreaming. I was dreaming, wasn't I, Reagan? It was all a dream?" "Yes," Reagan replied. "You were dreaming." "Thanks," Jenny said. "I'm going back to bed now." When Jenny had gone, Reagan laughed. "We won't have any more trouble from the blonde bimbo," she said. "Now, what are we going to do about Glenn?" She repeated the message again. It says, "Help me rest safe under the air." Perhaps the next letters were going to be FIELD. Is Glenn buried under the airfield? Does he want us to stop the construction work? No, Glenn can't be buried there, Jack said. Perhaps Glenn was going to write 2 sentences. Perhaps he wanted to say, "Help me rest safe." Under the airfield. But he didn't tell us what was under the airfield. "There must be something under the airfield," Tom said. "And Glenn wants us to find it," said Frankie went on. "Perhaps it's something about the traitor." "We must go to the airfield again," Jack told the others. "I want to use that metal detector there." "Perhaps Daryl will have some more ideas," Reagan said. "We'll ask him," Jack replied. "We're meeting him at 1 o'clock. We're going up in the old plane this afternoon. Tom has brought his camera." Chapter 10. The Battle in the Sky. The kids were in Daryl's van. They were on their way to the airfield at Halliford, about 30 kilometers from Lichford. Daryl was very interested in Glenn's message. "I agree with Tom and Frankie," he said. "There is something important under Lichford Green Airfield. Glenn wants you to find it." Suddenly, there was a loud noise in the sky above them. For a moment, a dark shape covered the sun. "It's a Spitfire," Tom said. "It's Glenn," Reagan whispered. Daryl laughed and shook his head. "No, it isn't Glenn," he said. "That's a real Spitfire. It flies from Halliford Airfield. We're nearly there now." "It's a real plane?" "Good," Jack said. "The past and the present are getting very mixed up." Daryl and the kids were going to fly in an old plane, a de Havilland Dragon Rapide. There were 8 seats for passengers in the plane, but they were very close together. Daryl and the kids climbed in. The heaviest people sat at the back, the lightest in the front. The pilot got in last. Reagan was sitting nearest to him. The pilot started the engines, and the old plane began to move. And then they were in the air. The children looked down. The cars on the roads were tiny. The little fields were green, yellow, and brown squares. "We'll soon be over Lichford Green Airfield," Daryl shouted after 10 minutes. The noise of the engines was loud and he had to shout, "Get your camera ready, Tom." The pilot took the plane lower. Now they could all see the airfield. They could see the old control tower and the other broken buildings. They could see the little round hill above the underground ops room. There were the 3 runways, and there were the facelift construction trucks. But there were no people working on the airfield. "Facelift construction hasn't started work yet," Jack said to himself. "Perhaps we will be able to use the metal detector. We really must get onto the airfield again." "Have you taken your photos, Tom?" the pilot shouted. "Yes, thanks. I've used all the film," Tom said. "Okay, I'm turning hack now. We don't—" Suddenly, there was complete silence. Had the plane's engine stopped? Frankie turned round quickly. Jack was shouting at her. She could see his mouth moving, but she couldn't hear his words. Behind Jack, Daryl was sitting very still. His eyes were open, but he wasn't seeing anything. Reagan and Tom were shouting now. Hut Frankie couldn't hear them either. Jack pointed at the pilot. Reagan touched the man on the arm. The pilot didn't move, but the plane flew on. What was happening? There was a dark shape in the sky coming towards them. Then there were two dark shapes, and close behind them were two more. They were planes. Tom knew what the planes were. They were Messerschmitt 109s, German fighter planes from the Second World War. The Messerschmitts had guns, and now they were shooting at the Dragon Rapide. The kids saw the bullets hitting the wings of the plane, but there was still no sound. Is this happening now or in the past? Jack asked himself. The Dragon Rapide turned slowly. Now it was going down. The ground was coming nearer and nearer. Frankie quickly unfastened her seatbelt. She moved carefully towards the pilot. He was holding the control column in his hands, but he was not controlling the plane. Frankie put her hands over his hands and tried to pull the column back. It was very difficult, but at last the control column moved. Soon the plane was flying straight ahead again, and now there were 3 more planes in the sky. They were Spitfires. The first Spitfire fired its guns. Its bullets hit one of the German planes, and the Messerschmitt began to fall. Then suddenly, the sky was empty. The Dragon Rapide's engines were roaring loudly. The children could hear the wind again, and the pilot was speaking. "Have much fuel?" the pilot was saying. "Have you all enjoyed the flight? Was it exciting?" "Oh, yes, we enjoyed it very much," Frankie replied. "It was very exciting." And the kids all laughed. When they were back in Daryl's van, the 4 friends told him what had happened. "Was that battle another psychic stain?" Jack asked him. "No, Glenn made that happen," Daryl said. "He was probably telling you to do something. But what?" "If Glenn can do that, he must be very powerful," Reagan said. "He can take us into the past whenever he wants to." "Perhaps we are giving Glenn his power," Jack said. "Yes, that's possible," Daryl replied. "Well, I'm going to get that metal detector for you this evening. Where do you want to go now?" "Take us to Radnor Road, please," Jack said. "I want to visit Mr. Terry Bowles." "Why?" Reagan asked. "I want to see that diary," Jack replied. "The diary is very important. I'm sure about that. The kids." It was 2 weeks later. The 4 friends had given their project about Litchford Green Airfield to Mrs. Tinker. She had been very pleased with it. "You've found out so much," she had said. "A lot of your facts surprised me. And they surprised Mr. Ballard at the museum, too. No one knew how the ops room was organized." Now the kids were sitting in Reagan's garden. The American girl was reading an article in the Litchford Gazette. "Listen to this," she said. The newspaper says, "Terry Bowles, the owner of Facelift Construction, heard the children shouting. He went down into the ops room to save them. That isn't true." "He didn't come to save us. He wanted to get the diamonds," Frankie said. "But Glenn stopped him." "The paper doesn't say anything about Glenn," Jack said. "And we didn't either. We couldn't, could we?" "No," Tom replied. "Mrs. Tinker doesn't believe in ghosts, but we do, and Terry Bowles does too." "The next part is terrible," Reagan said. She read from the newspaper again. It says, Terry Bowles saved the young people. He is a hero, but his grandfather wasn't a hero. He was a traitor. Mr. Bowles found his grandfather's diary. Squadron leader Alfred Leibridge Smith had been working for the Germans. He was a spy, and he was in charge of lots of other spies. The Germans had given him a bag of diamonds. He was going to pay his spies with them. Well, that part is true, but listen to this. Mr. Bowles will not keep the diamonds. He is going to use them for Litchford. He is going to build a museum under the airfield. It will make Litchford famous. Mr. Bowles is a hero. That's what it says. The article is wrong. Terry Bowles is not a hero. Reagan shouted suddenly. She threw the newspaper onto the ground. Glenn was the hero, Jack said. Yes, and Glenn is happy now. I'm glad about that, Reagan said. And we've told Florrie Skinner the truth about the crash. I'm glad about that too. Glenn tried to save the evacuees. He died because he tried to save them. He wanted us to help him rest. And now, he can rest. We'll always remember him, Frankie said, and we'll always remember those poor children. Reagan looked at her friends for half a minute. Then she took an envelope from her pocket. Florrie gave me this, she said. Reagan took a small picture from the envelope, a photo of 4 children. There were a few words written on the back of it. The kids. August, 1940. The friends looked at the old picture of the 4 young evacuees. In the photo, they were standing close together. The 2 boys had fair hair. One of the girls was very pretty. She had fair hair. The other girl was younger and shorter. Her hair was long and dark. It's us, Reagan whispered. We are those children. Florrie Skinner didn't see the ghosts of the evacuees in the underground room that day. She saw us. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then suddenly, a plane roared across the sky above them. It was a Spitfire.